Hello, hello everyone, and welcome to our weekly Torah studies class for the Torah portion of Behaalotecha, the age-old balance of individualism versus collectivism. So tonight we're going to be discussing a very central question. What does Judaism say about individualism in the context of the broader community? Am I an individual or am I an American? Am I an individual or am I a Jew? Right? Am I an American or an American Jew? Right? Am I a Jew? Right? What's my relationship to the land of Israel? Right? This question has so many broad implications on many elements of our life. Let's see what this week's Torah portion has to say about this issue. So the Torah tells us that the Jewish people are in the desert for a year. They're coming on their first anniversary of the Exodus from Egypt, and they are commanded to recreate the original Exodus experience by bringing a Korban Pesach, the Pesach sacrifice. And interestingly, it took place on Shabbos. This meant that the Jewish people were obligated to bring the Korban Pesach on Shabbos, even though normally it might be prohibited to do so. However, when it comes to the Korban Pesach on Shabbos, you are allowed. Now, how did this all work out in the temple? During a typical year, when Pesach did not fall on or around Shabbos, a person would go to the temple with their animal. The animal would be slaughtered and the sacrifice would be brought on the afternoon before the Pesach would begin. Then you would immediately go home with the animal. You would roast it and it would be the centerpiece of your Seder table. Now, what happened when Pesach began on Sunday? When Pesach begins on Sunday, that means on Shabbos afternoon is when the Korban Pesach has to be brought, and then Saturday night begins the first Seder. It's a little bit more challenging because on Shabbos, a person would not be allowed to carry and take their animal from the temple back to their house. So that means a person had to be in the temple the entire Shabbos afternoon. Only when Shabbos started were they able to then take it and go back home, which meant the Seder was going to be delayed tremendously. Now, the Talmud tells us that during the Second Temple era, there was a period of time where Pesach never began on Sunday. Decades upon decades went by where the Jews were never faced this issue, the more complicated issue of having to sacrifice the Korban Pesach on a Shabbos and deal with the Seder beginning on Saturday night. And they actually forgot the law. They weren't sure. They did not remember. And the sages of the era, the sages of that time, debated back and forth. Are you allowed to bring the Pesach sacrifice on Shabbos or not? The leading sages of that era were known as the Bnei Beseira. And they said, you are not allowed to bring the Korban Pesach on Shabbos. Forget it, it's out. Hillel, he disagreed. Hillel felt that you absolutely are able to bring the Korban Pesach on Shabbos, and he actually proved and demonstrated that he was correct. Due to the important nature of this ruling and everything that surrounded the debate at that time, the Bnei Beseira stepped down from their leadership of the rabbinic court in the land of Israel, and Hillel was appointed in their stead. Let's go to text number 2 here. One year, the 14th of Nisan fell on the Shabbos. They asked Hillel the elder, does the Passover sacrifice override the Shabbos? He said, is there only one Passover in the year that overrides the Sabbath? There are in fact more than 300 Passovers in the year that override the Shabbos. Everyone in the temple gathered around him in protest. He said, the daily Tamid sacrifice is a communal offering and it overrides the Shabbos. Likewise, the Passover sacrifice is a communal offering and it overrides the Shabbos. Moreover, I was taught by my teachers explicitly that the Passover sacrifice overrides the Shabbos. That very day, they appointed Hillel as the Nasi, and he taught the laws of the Pesach sacrifice. So Hillel did two things, right? Number one, he demonstrated conclusively that this is the way he was taught. His teachers, in fact, told him, and it was passed down from generation to generation with certainty and with clarity, that the Korban Pesach overrides Shabbos. And he explained why. Because the Korban Pesach, this Pesach sacrifice, is like a communal offering. And communal offerings override the laws of Shabbos, just as there are multiple communal sacrifices that are offered on Shabbos, so too the Pesach offering is one of them. So what was the debate between Hillel and Ben Beseira? The debate was, is the Pesach offering a communal offering? If yes, it would override the Shabbos. Or do we view the Pesach offering as a personal, private, individual offering, and therefore it would not override the Shabbos? Why was this such a difficult question to answer? Because the Pesach offering has elements that make it similar to a personal, private offering, and some elements that make it similar to a communal offering. Let's look how the Rambam describes it. It is a positive commandment to offer the Paschal sacrifice on the 14th day of the month of Nisan after midday. This offering is brought only from lambs or goats, a male in his first year. Both men and women are obligated in this mitzvah. If all the information that you had was this text alone, it would certainly seem that it is a personal, private offering. Each person, whether a man or a woman, has to go out, purchase a lamb, and bring it as a sacrifice. However, if we learn further, this is not something that you can do by yourself. Yes, you have a personal obligation, but it cannot be done alone. The Pesach sacrifice must be brought as part of a group. Go to text number 4 from the book of Shmos. Speak to the entire community of Israel, saying, on the 10th of this month, let each one take a lamb for each parental home, a lamb for each household. But if the household is too small for a lamb, then he and his neighbor who is nearest to his house shall take one according to the number of people, each one according to one's ability to eat, shall you be counted for the lamb. So here we see there's a communal element. The communal element it is that you are bringing that sacrifice as a group. It's not one lamb per person. Rather, each person is obligated to be part of a group that is going to eat the lamb, and it is prohibited for there to be leftovers. Not only are you eating it as part of the group, but even when you went to bring the animal to the temple to be slaughtered, it also was a group experience. We go to the Mishnah. The Paschal lamb was slaughtered in 3 groups. As the verse states, and the whole assembly of the congregation of Israel shall slaughter it in the afternoon. The first group of people sacrificing the offering entered, and when the temple courtyard filled, they closed the doors of the temple courtyard. After the sacrifices were finished, the first group exited, and the second group entered. After their sacrifices were finished, the second group left, and the third group entered. So again, here we have a real communal feel. It wasn't the individual bringing his animal and then it was slaughtered, but rather 3 large groups, right? 1/3 of the Jewish people entered the temple at one time in order to bring that sacrifice. The rabbis were unsure if it's the private or the personal. They felt perhaps it's more private. However, Hillel answered convincingly and conclusively that it is in fact a communal sacrifice, and therefore it can be brought on Shabbos. Now, before we explain some of his rationale, it's important to appreciate who he was and where he came from, and why ultimately this incident made him the leader and the head of the rabbinic court. Hillel did not grow up in the land of Israel. He was a Babylonian Jew. He came to the land of Israel penniless because he desperately wanted to study Torah. He wanted to enter into the yeshiva. At that time, there was a payment, there was tuition, there was a cost associated with entering into the yeshiva, and he had to work in order to be able to do so. He was a wood chopper. The Talmud tells of an incident where he was not able to work, he did not have any income, he was not able to pay the fee, the tuition to get into the Beis Medrash. It was in the middle of the winter, and he climbed on top of the Beis Medrash where there was a skylight. And he looked into the Beis Medrash and he listened intently and carefully in order to absorb every word. But he stayed there so long that he froze and he practically lost consciousness. And they thank God they found him and were able to resuscitate him and save his life. But that was his commitment to studying Torah. So Hillel was a penniless immigrant who came to study Torah. They noticed that he was a brilliant student, and he grew from not only being a brilliant student to being a brilliant teacher. And then it was this defining moment with the Bnei Beseira, the debate of whether the Korban Pesach as a personal or communal offering, when he was appointed to head the rabbinic court. And he was so prominent that for 14 generations, again, 14 generations, it was descendants of Hillel who led the Jewish people and directed the rabbinic court. How did this start? It all started with this debate regarding the Pesach sacrifice on Shabbos. Because it wasn't just a halachic legal debate, but it's within this debate that captured the worldview of Hillel and demonstrated so beautifully his leadership style, which is why he was appointed to the leadership, and for 14 generations, it was not removed from his family. So back to this debate about the Korban Pesach. So the Bnei Beseira, right, they felt that the Korban Pesach, the Pesach sacrifice, is a personal offering. Right? They did recognize that, where did they come up with this? Because when the original Pesach offering is brought in the Torah, there simply was no communal element at all. So they point to the Torah where it says, Moshe summoned all the elders of Israel and said to them, draw forth or buy for yourselves sheep for your families and slaughter the Pesach sacrifice. And you shall take a bunch of hyssop and immerse it in the blood that's in the basin, and you shall extend to the lintel and to the doorpost and the blood that is in the basin. And you shall not go out any man from the entrance of his house until morning. So the Bnei Beseira point to the original sacrifice. There's no communal element to it. There was no going to some central location in groups and sacrificing it. People did it in their house, and they put the blood on the doorpost of their house and were commanded not to leave their house. The original Korban Pesach was very much a personal, private, individual religious experience. They do agree that later it was altered a little bit. Later it was changed and a communal element was introduced to it. But from the perspective of the Bnei Beseira, it is essentially and fundamentally a private, personal, individual obligation, and therefore cannot override Shabbos. Now, Hillel had a different approach, right? Hillel taught that the first one didn't count. In other words, the fact that the first one was private would not and did not define the nature of the Korban Pesach for all generations further. That's not how it works. So based on the original Pesach, the rabbi surmised that the sacrifice is inherently a private event. Hillel countered that the sacrifice was enshrined in law as communal. Hillel countered that after that first year, the Pesach sacrifice became a communal sacrifice and was a communal sacrifice for all time afterwards. Therefore, the definition of the Pesach sacrifice is communal, and therefore it can be brought on Shabbos. Now, as we mentioned before, this was not just a legal dispute between the Bnei Beseira and Hillel, but this has far-reaching implications and has to do with the essence of who Hillel was, his leadership style, and why he was approaching. At the core of this issue, at the core of this discussion is, am I an individual or am I part of a community? How do I view myself? How do I define myself? How do I react to the bigger and broader world? Is the focus on myself or is the focus on the community? What did Hillel teach? Right? Hillel taught that when it came to the first communal offering, when it came to the first Korban Pesach, what was the emphasis then and at that time? The emphasis was it was a private individual experience. What does that teach us? That teaches us that the first step in growth as a human being, step number one, that precedes the communal element, is the focus and the work of you as an individual. Anyone who's been on an airplane knows the flight attendants are going to say, if pressure drops, if the oxygen mask is going to go, first put the mask on yourself, then you're going to be able to help others. The first thing you have to do is develop your own identity, develop your own spiritual core, your spiritual integrity, then we can work about the community. And we actually see this from the concept that there's something that's called the 12 tribes. We're going out to text number 7, Rabbi Yaakov Aryeh Guterman, the author of Birkei Aviv. We'll give you a little biography of him. He was born in 1792. He passed away in 1874. He's the founder of the Radziner Hasidic dynasty. Rabbi Guterman was a pupil of Rabbi Simcha Bunim of Pshischa and Rabbi Yitzchak Kailish, and he attracted a large Hasidic following. His teachings were published in Divrei Aviv and Birkei Aviv. He writes, on the verse, and Bilam saw Israel dwelling by their tribes, Rashi comments, he saw each tribe dwelling separately, not intermingled. What is the virtue in this? Each person ought to know that their respective soul's potential, so that they can serve God according to their potential, according to the divine attribute in which their soul is rooted. This is the deeper meaning of when Bilam saw Israel dwelling by their tribes. Each tribe recognized its uniqueness and served God according to its potential. Had they been intermingled, each would have imitated the other, even though the service would have had no correlation to the root of their souls and would have offered their souls no rectification. So the Radziner Rebbe tells us, why were there 12 tribes and not just one collective Jewish people? It's because everyone is different. And the fact that we're all different is wonderful, is beautiful, and it's godly, it's divine, it's holy. There's 12 tribes because that represented 12 different personalities, 12 different character traits, 12 different ways of approaching God. In other words, to be an individual, to be you, is critical, it's vital, and it's important. We're not just lumping everyone together, everyone has to be the same. We value and appreciate your own individual identity, and that is in fact step number 1. However, Hillel then says, just as the first Pesach offering was an individual one, but the second Pesach offering was a communal one, so too, it's not just about ourselves as an individual. We have to then turn our focus and our attention to the community and what it means to be part of a community. Our communal identity is absolutely central to our personal identity. Just think about it. Without being part of a community, you know what we end up being? Lonely. We're by ourselves. And that is certainly no way to live. And we all can appreciate that when we identify as part of our community, we connect with other people. This is one of the key elements and factors of life, for not just for getting rid of our loneliness, but more importantly, the powerful feeling of our own identity when we are part of a bigger and broader and a greater group. And this, of course, also is the key to humility, right? To empathy, because it's not just about you. So Hillel teaches us that prioritizing personal identity versus communal identity is a 2-part process of growth. The very first step in becoming a people is developing the individual. One's unique talents can then be channeled in the collective identity. So the first step is discover who you are, your likes, your dislikes, your character traits, your personality, all of those unique elements that are you. Become you, know you, define yourself. But don't leave it at that. You should then take all of who you are and direct it towards and become part of and channel it for the benefit of our collective identity at all. Do what you can for the benefit of the community. This idea is beautifully captured in perhaps one of the most famous statements and teachings of Hillel. It comes from Pirkei Avos, right? The ethics from our fathers, which we traditionally read between the holiday of Pesach and Shavuos, and many communities have the tradition to study it not just through Shavuos, but all the way till Rosh Hashanah. Hillel would also say, if I am not for myself, who is for me? And if I am only for myself, what am I? And if not now, when? So this is a perfect re-articulation of everything that we have been discussing so far. And this all perfectly, totally correlates to the Pesach offering. First, he says, if I am not for myself, who is for me? Hillel says you cannot sacrifice your own identity, you cannot sacrifice your talents, you can't sacrifice your skills or your personality for the sake of the community. You must be you, critical and vital. But then he says, and if I'm only for myself, right, what am I? If I'm only for myself, I'm alone. That's nothing. A person has to be able to channel their personality, their character to the rest of the community. The third line, and if not now, when, we'll get to it in just a moment. Now, the Rebbe comments that it's no surprise that this is in the first chapter of Pirkei Avos, which is read directly after Pesach. Because as we said earlier, it's this statement of Hillel, right, can really be traced back. This seminal, this defining statement of Hillel can really be traced back to the whole debate with Bnei Beseira, or whether you could bring the Korban Pesach on Shabbos. How do we redefine the debate in light of this Mishnah? What is if I am not for myself, who is for me? This is Hillel emphasizing that you have to have your own personal private identity. What did Hillel teach? That yes, the first sacrifice when the Jews were in Egypt, it was personal and private, which means that the first step in growth for a human being is to recognize your own individual identity. However, Hillel says you cannot do the Pesach sacrifice on your own, right? You must be part of a group in order to be able to do it. And this is the meaning of the next line. If I'm only for myself, what am I? If you are only for yourself, you're not able to bring the Pesach sacrifice. You need the group to be in it. And here now it's crystal clear. What does it mean? And if not now, when? What does now mean? Shabbos. Because of the fact that the Korban Pesach is a communal offering, therefore, when is it going to be brought? It's going to be brought now, even when the holiday takes place on Pesach. Text number 9, in the Rebbe's words. If I am not for myself, who is for me? Means that essentially the Passover sacrifice is a personal one. Every individual must bring his own offering purchased with his own money and be a part of his own group. But on the other hand, if I'm only for myself, what am I? Meaning the sacrifice must have the properties of a communal sacrifice. And moreover, if it were only a personal offering, only for myself, it would override the Shabbos, and Hillel himself would never have become the Nasi. Thus he says, what would I be? Now we can ask, even if the Pesach sacrifice is a communal affair, a communal sacrifice only overrides the Shabbos if it is one that cannot be brought on the other day. Therefore, Hillel says, if not now, when? Meaning that the Pesach sacrifice can only be brought on the 14th of Nisan. When that coincides with the Shabbos, it's a communal sacrifice, and you're able to bring the sacrifice on Shabbos. So Hillel teaches that a person has to have the right balance between the individual and the communal. This not only applies, of course, to Pesach. This does not only apply to how we develop ourselves as an individual and a community, but this perspective is critical as to how we learn to relate to each other. We know there's a critical mitzvah in the Torah that says, "V'ahavta l'reacha kamocha." A person has to love their fellow like themselves. But how? How is it possible to love somebody else like yourself? You are you. They are not you. How does it work? How does that translate? And it makes it even much more difficult. Forget loving the person. Sometimes it's very difficult to like a person. A person may have attributes that you find very uncomfortable, very unsettling, very disconcerting. How are you supposed to be able to develop love for that other person? There are two approaches. A person can approach their love for their fellow either as a communal event or as an individual. Let's go to option number 1, which is the collective approach. The collective approach is At the end of the day, the Jewish people share the same soul. We have one spiritual identity. We're one nation, one people under one God. The Talmud says any fast day that does not include sinners of Israel is not an effective fast. The Talmud says if the Jewish people are facing a devastating plague, a pandemic, a drought, an illness, the Jewish people are being affected. And we declare a fast day in order to help mitigate the damage and to bring about God's healing. It must be all inclusive. You cannot say the sinners of Israel stand outside the community, they don't need to participate. If we are not together as one, it's not going to work. Even the sinners of Israel, with their different behavior, one people, one soul, under one God, we are a collective. We're one unit. That is one approach that a person could think about, integrate within themselves, which will allow you to feel love and closeness to another person, because at the end of the day, we are a collective, we are one. And it's not our differences that matter, it's our collective commonality that matters. And then there's the individual approach to loving your fellow. And in the individual approach, there are also two different modes. Number one is the recognition that every individual has talent. Every individual has something to offer and has something to contribute, and we need the contribution of every single person. When you have a large company, you have certain people that are the CEO, some people do marketing, some people do bookkeeping, some people do shipping, some people do, there are so many different jobs. There are people who drive the trucks, there are people who pack boxes. If you took out any one of them, the company could not succeed, the company would fail. Every person has the role, every person contributes in a unique way, and we need to appreciate and love every individual person for what they bring to the table. The Alter Rebbe writes, everyone possesses a quality in which they surpass others, a quality for which others need you. Using the body as an analogy, it is true that the feet are the lowest part and the head is the highest and most impressive. Nevertheless, in a certain sense, the feet have an advantage in that one cannot walk without them. They also serve to hold up the body and the head, and so the head is not complete without the feet. Similarly, the Jewish people comprise one body. Even if someone thinks they are like a head compared to someone else, the truth is you cannot be complete without that person. That person is in fact filling in something you are lacking. With this mindset, one will feel humble before others and not try to identify who is a head and who is a foot. This humility brings unity, bringing down God's presence among us. So even if you meet someone and in your estimation you think they're a foot, recognize and appreciate that that foot absolutely has something valuable to contribute. May not be as flashy, as exciting, but without that foot, you are not going anywhere. Every single Jew has something to contribute that's valuable and unique, and therefore is worthy of your absolute love. However, there's a much deeper way that a person can generate love for their fellow by focusing on their individual quality. And what does that mean? We are loving them for the fact that they are an individual, for themselves, not just because they have a talent and that talent contributes to the overall well-being of whether it's that company or society as a whole. It's much more than that. The Alter Rebbe writes, and the soul and the spirit, who can know their greatness and quality and their root and source in the living God? This means you're not just loving somebody because of what they can do. Maybe they're a foot, maybe they're a head, maybe they're somewhere in between. We're not loving you because of what you do, but we're loving you for who you are. If God made you, God saw fit that you should be walking the earth. Wow, that's incredible, that's holy, that's godly, that is beautiful. So we see there are three different approaches looking at the collective and the individual that are critical for us being able to relate to each other and to fill the important mitzvah of loving your fellow as yourself. So the personal versus collective dynamic plays out in our ability to love others. To love others, we must appreciate them. We can appreciate them as part of a whole. They're part of our group. We're one. I love them. Or as individuals contributing to the whole. Everyone plays a part and they contribute something that is unique that nobody else does. And there, of course, we love them. And then finally, going even deeper, we love them as individuals, regardless of the whole. We're not focusing on what talent or skill that they bring to the table, but we love them as them for being who they are. So three different levels, a whole, an individual, which interact with each other and allow us to truly love and feel profound affection for our friends, for our neighbors, and for our community. So far, we looked at a healthy approach for balancing the individual versus the communal in terms of our own personal identities. We looked at balancing the personal and the collective when it comes to developing healthy relationships with other people. But now we're going to talk about how balancing the individual and collective affects the way that God looks at us. Let's go to text number 13, the prophet Yirmiyahu, Jeremiah. Behold, I bring them from the north country and gather them from the uttermost ends of the earth, the blind and the lame among them, the pregnant and birthing women all together. A great company shall they return there. Looking at this verse, you could see how God is going to redeem the Jewish people as a collective, as a unit. God is not looking at you as a Democrat, as a Republican, as a Packers fan, a Bears fan, as a Cubs fan, or a Brewers fan. All of the Jewish people, God is going to gather together. A great company shall they return here. This is how God looks at us. However, if you look at so the prophet tells us that God will redeem us as one united nation, but also that God will redeem each of us by the hand. As we see in the book of Isaiah, the book of Yeshayahu, and it shall come to pass on that day that God shall gather from the flood of the river to the stream of Egypt, and you shall be gathered one by one, O children of Israel. So God does not just view us as a collective, as a large body of people, but God loves each one of us on an individual, personal level, and God is going to redeem each and every one of us on a personal level as well. So here we have learned the way that looking at ourselves with the individual and the collective perspective impact our own identities, how we relate to others, and as well as how Hashem relates to us. Now we're going to conclude with a very beautiful quote from Rabbi Lord Jonathan Sacks. He writes, I once had the opportunity to ask the Catholic writer Paul Johnson what had struck him most about Judaism during the long period he spent researching it for his masterly A History of the Jews. He replied in roughly these words: there have been in the course of history societies that emphasize the individual, like the secular West today. And there have been others that placed weight on the collective, communist Russia or China, for example. Judaism, he continued, was the most successful example he knew of that managed the delicate balance between both giving equal weight to individual and collective responsibility. Judaism was a religion of strong individuals and strong communities. This, he said, was very rare and difficult and constituted one of our greatest achievements. It was a wise and subtle observation. Without knowing it, he had in effect paraphrased Hillel's aphorism. If I am not for myself, who will be individual responsibility? But if I'm only for myself, excuse me, but if I'm only for myself, what am I? Right? There has to be collective responsibility as well. Thank you so much for joining us for the class. God willing, I look forward to seeing you next Monday again. Have a fabulous and wonderful day.